Hi everybody, it's meteorologist Joe Cioffi here on this lovely Tuesday in the Northeast. Just an absolutely gorgeous weather day that we have not just in the Northeast, but in the Mid-Atlantic, most of the Southeast, the Midwest. The only spots where we're seeing any kind of inclement weather are in Florida and up in parts of the Pacific Northwest, and that's really about it. It's very, very quiet. We're in a very quiet weather pattern, but things are about to change, and we are going to see some wholesale changes in the upper air pattern after this week is done, so that next week and perhaps beyond that, we will see, I think, a much more active pattern, a colder pattern, I think, for the eastern states overall, and there will be opportunities for some rain. Maybe even in some places they'll see their first snowflakes of the season, perhaps in the Great Lakes and eventually into interior areas of New England and upstate New York. So a lot going on. Also a little bit of activity to point out in the tropics in the long range that I think is possible. And we actually have, a few people have asked about this, there's another gale center that is headed for Ireland and Britain and Scotland. This one's going to travel a little further to the south. It's going to be coming in from the west-southwest. So it's definitely going to be a different track from what we saw with the post-cyclone of Ophelia, which had produced hurricane force winds over Ireland. This one will be a bit tamer than that, but it will certainly be a gale center. So we'll touch on that also as well. So stand by. We're going to switch over to the video part of this presentation and then come back, and I'll get on the chat board in the meantime, and we'll talk during and, of course, afterwards. So just hang on one second. We're going to take a look going forward here, now that we have no hurricanes, no tropical storms running around, not just affecting the United States or the islands, but as we just saw, not affecting parts of the British Isles and Europe. So everything's kind of quiet. So I think we're going to start looking ahead as to what the weather's going to be like over the next week or two. And we do have a bit of a pattern change going on. I just want to start off, though, with the short-term weather. This is the GFS model showing where we're seeing at least some measurable rain and snow this evening. You can see there's a little bit of activity going on in southeastern Canada. We've got some rain down in Florida. We have a little bit of action up in the Pacific Northwest in western Washington and Oregon with some snow in southwestern Canada, and that's about it. Now, going forward for the rest of this week, we do have some significant moisture coming into the Pacific Northwest that moves down into northern California Thursday night into Friday. It's a quick shot. There'll be some snows in the mountainous areas. Also getting a little bit of rain down in parts of New Mexico, a little bit of shower activity down in Florida and northern Maine, where there's some colder Canadian air coming into southeastern Canada. Other than that, the weather around much of the country just very, very quiet, and that's going to take us through the weekend. Now, there are going to be some changes going on in the West. Through this weekend, more action comes into the Pacific Northwest and northernmost California, but we start to see a bit of a weather front setting up. This is the map for Sunday. We do have a weather front that is showing up. Let's see if I can get this to draw. It requires me to actually use a mouse when I'm not, because I don't have a touch screen available to me. But you can see the weather front here. Pushing eastward. There is some cooler air behind it that'll be moving out of Canada into the northern plains. Here in the east, it's going to be pretty mild with the high offshore. Nothing particularly humid, though, but this front doesn't have a whole lot of support with it because the Gulf of Mexico is basically cut off, and we don't have a whole lot of energy to play with in the upper atmosphere, at least not yet. But as we move ahead through the early part of next week, we're going to start to see some important changes. And you'll notice that you get a system that comes down into the lakes and into Ohio. That's low pressure there into western New York with some upper air energy. And there's a fairly decent shot here of some cooler air that begins to ride down out of central Canada and over the Great Lakes into the Northeast. Not cold enough yet for some snow, but at least it's a shot of it. And we're going into the middle part of next week. Now, what's happening in the upper atmosphere? And this is where we're seeing the big changes. So I'm going to put the jet stream map up. I'm going to go to the upper levels of the atmosphere. And one of the things, as we back it off to the present day, we'll actually push it into Wednesday and into Thursday. You'll notice that you get this ridge once again by the end of the week and into the weekend builds into the eastern part of the United States. You have this upper high right here off the East Coast, and you've got that trough out in the west. But something also, by the way, you do have low pressure south of Greenland out in the Atlantic. Now something starts to happen here that changes the perspective of what's happening, what's going on in the Pacific. You have this long, what I would refer to as this fire hose jet stream that moves right across the Pacific and into the Pacific Northwest. It's a pattern like this that forces the ridge to build in the east. But all weather models that we look at show that ridge to break down. The upper low that's back in Alaska retrogrades further west and cuts a trough down into the Pacific toward Hawaii. So that allows a big upper high to build in the western part of the United States, and because of that, you get a deep trough in the eastern part of the United States. So this is the first weather front that we showed you before. So now we've got a trough in the east, a general ridge out in the west, troughing that extends down from the Aleutians over to just east-northeast of Hawaii. And we also have a big ridge that's building up out in the Atlantic. So this is a big change in the upper flow. For the first time in well over a month, we're getting rid of this ridge in the east that keeps wanting to come back and, well, rear its nice weather ugly head. I know a lot of people don't want it warm. They want the cool autumn weather. Well, you're going to get it with this pattern. All the models have kind of locked on to this. The European's the same. The GFS is about the same in terms of the overall structure. And the other thing is, as we go forward, is that in general, the troughing does continue in the east. And actually, if you notice in the long range, now I don't know whether this is going to happen or not. Weather models, in my experience, love to develop blocking patterns. And we've got this big blocking high that pops up at the end of the 14 to 16 day time frame. That is too far out to have any kind of reliability. Weather models will show 20 out of the last two blocking patterns. I mean, it shows it a lot. Does it happen? Not so much. But the signs are there that it could happen when we look at some of what's going on in the long range. One thing that is for sure in a pattern like this, I think, is that at least with these troughs, these weather systems coming in to the west, and the fact that we're going to have some troughing in the east, at least will afford the opportunity for some much needed rainfall going forward. The other thing I want to point out as far as the weather in the U.S. is concerned, and this is with respect to the tropics, I'm going to just flip regions here and go down to so we could see what's going on in the Caribbean. I think that on the whole, pressures in the Caribbean going forward for the next for later this week and through this coming weekend and next week are going to be on the low side, particularly later next week with what's going on in the United States. So do not be surprised if something tropical does come out of here in the longer term. The model has been showing that for a while, and I think there is some support in the possibility of having something coming out of the Caribbean in the longer term. The other thing I want to show you is I'm going to go back to Europe, because we spent so much time there, and I'm really appreciative of all of you who watched from Ireland in particular, who got hit pretty hard with the remnants of Ophelia. We do have another gale center that is approaching for the later Friday into Friday night and Saturday. It's fairly strong. It's not the pressure gradient is not quite as tight as what it was with the remnant low of Ophelia that became post-tropical and produced 100-mile-an-hour plus wind gusts. But this does take a track right along the south coast. I think that this could bring some gales and rain for the Ireland and for Britain, Scotland, and so on. This low tracks right across England and then eventually winds up into Norway. But this is a non-tropical system. A few of you have asked me about this, so I just want to point that out, that you might get into some gales here along about Friday night into Saturday. In fact, I'm going to pull up a sounding just offshore so we can see at least what kind of winds that this is generating. And actually, from where the low center is, it's showing sustained winds of 30 knots, and just above the ground level, going up maybe about 500 to 1,000 feet, there's some 40 to 50 knot winds. So, there's going to be some gales, but I don't think you're going to see the crazy winds that you saw along the south coast with the remnants of Ophelia. So, again, thank you very much for looking at my channel with the weather updates that I was giving last week and through this past weekend. So we'll be, of course, focused now, unless the tropics get busy. It's time to start looking at the possibilities of wintertime weather going forward. We are going to be exploring the long range on a daily basis to see how it changes from run to run. And you know what? Why don't we take a look at the European model, by the way? And we might as well. I got a little extra time here. So we'll take a look at what the European model does. And the European is not that different from the GFS. It actually gets to a strong upper high that builds up toward Greenland by the time we get to the latter part of next week. And you can see that the trough on the European, you've got this broad trough in the eastern part of the United States, and this ridge that builds up out in the west, trough in the Gulf of Alaska down toward Hawaii. These are signature patterns, a lot of amplitude here. So you got a lot of depth and amplitude. So this, I think, opens the possibility up, as I said, much like the GFS does, where we are going to see opportunities for some much needed rainfall. Perhaps in some areas we'll probably see some of the first snowfalls in the colder parts, the upper Great Lakes, and maybe up through parts of upstate New York and northern New England through all of this. And for the places that have been rather dry for the last several weeks, some much needed rainfall. And we'll see how it plays out in the west with the ridge in the west. It'll cut off the possibilities of rain, although there is a system that's being shown by the European that kind of undercuts that ridge and moves into Northern California later in the period. We'll see if that has any value or not, because as we know, models do like to change quite a bit. By the way, here is the new GFS, which only goes out to Saturday, where we have that ridge in the east, trough in the west. So at least the weather in the eastern part of the United States is going to be fine and dandy right through this weekend. So stand by. I'll come back. We'll take some questions and comments and in the chat. And just give me 1 second. I'll be right with you. Okay, it's me. I'm back. All right. Scott Olson saying worldwide weather forecaster Joe is going to be a heck of a lot smarter by this time next year. I had to tell you something. Doing these YouTube videos and having to look at, never anticipating that I would get an audience from everywhere. It has been, and it will continue to be. The adventure into Ireland and England and Scotland the last couple of days with the post-tropical cyclone Ophelia has been quite a learning experience indeed. And I'm sure there are going to be many, many more learning experiences for me. And that's what meteorology is, basically. It's a lifelong learning experience because you do get a lot of wounds that you have to kind of lick clean along the way. Frank Finari, you're asking about wintertime forecasts from my standpoint. I have to tell you, I've tried. I'm not a long-range guy. There's so much technical stuff that you need to look at with respect to the long range, and it's just, I've never been able to really get my head around it. I get around, I've gotten my head around some of it, but it's just too much. And frankly, for me, it's much more fun to deal with the short range. It really is. And that's where I think I always spend my focus on. Mary Daniels, by the way, thank you so much for hitting Super Chat tonight. Gets me a nice cup of coffee right after I'm done with my dinner. And the weather, yes, wonderfully boring in beautiful Ohio. I was talking with a friend of mine today driving to Cleveland and saying that the fall weather in Ohio is just spectacular. And I'm sure with all the fall colors, with the changing leaves, it's got to be beautiful. And with the weather so nice throughout much of the country, certainly take advantage of all that while we still have it. Thomas, you earlier asked about Siberian snow cover. So far, the snow cover growth rate has been relatively subdued. And for those of you who don't know what that is, there is a theory with regards to, and there's been a lot of work done, research work done on the rate of growth of snow cover in Siberia during the month of October, particularly the southern flank of that, and the kinds of winters that we have in the east. And there seems to have been a solid connection made with rapid snow cover growth rate in the month of October and colder than average and snowier than average winters in general in the eastern in the eastern part of the United States. It worked for a while until the last couple of winters where it didn't really work very well. So usually it's always been my experience that once a theory gets out there and everybody seems to know about it, that's usually when it stops working or it finds a way to stop working. So far the snow cover growth has been subdued, but it's not where it is now on the 17th of October, but where it finishes. And we'll take a look at that some more in the coming weeks. As you saw from the video tonight, from the weather portion of the video tonight, we are going to see a pattern change. It's going to mean for opportunities for much needed rain in the east, which I think is good. It is going to also bring down more frequent visits from Canada with regards to cold air, and I think the upper pattern is set up for perhaps some early snows, albeit the usual early snows, the first flurries, the first snow showers, maybe the first snow squalls at some point as we go into the very end of October and the beginning of November, which is about when you would normally see it. Although in the last couple of winters, that kind of weather wound up being a bit delayed. So at least we're going to see the pattern revert to some semblance of normalcy. It seems that's kind of the flavor I'm getting with things right now, that we get rid of this ridge in the east, that it's going to evolve into at least some sense of normalcy with regards to having things happen kind of the way they're supposed to happen, and not necessarily in one of those odd extreme ways. The troughing in the east could open the possibilities up for other things to occur as well. I did talk about the tropics. I've been of the belief that with pressures low in the Caribbean later during next week and beyond, that we could see another tropical system come out of there. We are now getting close to the time of year where if you're going to see something, that's usually the spot where you would wind up seeing something fire up, and I think that is certainly possible. And of course, with a trough in the east, it could lend to all sorts of other possibilities. But you know what? Got to have it happen first. So why don't we? We have to wait on that. And yes, Mary Daniels, the weather is wonderfully boring. Beautiful sunsets. Really take advantage of it when the weather's like this, especially when we're not dealing with any kind of tropical humidity, which is always appalling. We are, of course, Scott Olson, looking at the very dry conditions in California with regards to the wildfires, and You are going to see that shot of rain come in for Thursday, and then there's another one that follows that one. But I don't know that it's going to be enough to make a real dent in all of this. And if the ridge goes back into the western part of the United States now, that's going to cut off rain systems from coming in to the Pacific Northwest and probably shifting them a bit further to the north. But the other thing to watch for in the coming weeks is whether we see some blocking developing in the North Atlantic. The models are all hinting at that, so that could lead to some complications when we get toward the end of October and the beginning of November. Liam McGrath, with regards to Ireland, it looks like there may be a big weather system headed. Yes, for Friday and Saturday, absolutely. As I pointed out, there is going to be a gale center that's coming in from the west-southwest that is not going to be as strong as the post-tropical cyclone Ophelia was, but there will certainly be gales, and this one might produce some widespread rain across Ireland and England and Scotland as it moves on through for Friday night and Saturday. And they're calling it Storm Brian. I wonder why they're calling it Brian, Liam. Did they do that? Did they name those storms out there? Is that, and by the way, is that government named, or is that being done by some sort of private enterprise, like when the Weather Channel names winter storms here, which is, to me, I don't see the point. I mean, I do understand why they're doing it, but I don't see the practical value in it. And Trish and Lou, snow around the end of the month in Wisconsin, Arctic air, first week of November, the CFS and GFS. Yes, I think so. I think you're going to see, areas that normally get their first snows during the end of October, beginning of November. I think that is going to play out according to plan as long as this pattern change happens, which I think it will. I'm looking, by the way, at the new GFS, which does bring that trough into the east, and then pops up a ridge again all of a sudden by the end of, as you get toward Halloween, and tries to drop the trough again in the west. That's the new run. Who knows? Because that's far enough out in the long range where we get into squirrely land. But right now, I'm pretty confident that we're going to see the weather pattern flip a bit for at least a little while. And hopefully for you snow lovers, I know you want to get rid of that ridge in the east altogether. We'll see if we can get that to happen. The trough in the east is also going to afford opportunities for much needed rain, which we certainly need. Steve Addy, Joe, the UK Met Office names these storms the second named storm after Aileen. Okay, very good. So that's good to know. So I guess they name these gale centers as they go along. It does give them a little bit of an identifier. If that's at least that's a government. If that's a government entity that's doing it, that's I'm totally okay with that. But that gale center is going to produce some wind and rain. Again, I don't think we're going to see it to the level of what you just saw with respect to the remnants of Ophelia. Okay, folks, it's almost showtime for me. Thank you for hitting Super Chat tonight. I really appreciate it very much. And we're going to, of course, keep you updated over the next number of days and beyond as we get eventually out of this dry pattern in the east and go into something a little more active. We'll see how it plays out. In the meantime, I want everybody to promise they have a great Tuesday evening and a very good Wednesday. We'll see you tomorrow. We'll live stream again probably around this time, around 6:30 Eastern time. Take care, folks. Talk to you tomorrow.